The flashing red and blue lights bounced off my farmhouse windows, casting eerie shadows across my living room. It was 6:30 in the morning, and I hadn't even had my first cup of coffee before I heard the knock a loud, impatient bang, 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 on my door. I opened it to see Officer Miller standing with his arms crossed, his face somewhere between exhausted and amused. Behind him, standing on the edge of my property with her phone recording, was none other than my nightmare in yoga pants, Karen. "Sir, we got a noise complaint," Officer Miller said, rubbing his forehead. "Let me guess," I muttered, glancing past him at Karen, who was standing like she had just won a court case, arms folded, smug as ever. Was it my rooster this time? Or maybe my cow farted too loudly. "Your chickens," the officer corrected, barely suppressing an eye roll. Apparently, they were yelling at 5 a.m. I turned to look at my flock, who were pecking around completely oblivious to the fact that they were now criminals in Karen's eyes. "Officer," I said, trying to keep a straight face. "Last I checked, chickens cluck. They don't yell." Karen suddenly marched up, waving her phone in my face. "I have it on video," she screeched. They were screaming. It sounded like they were being tortured. My entire morning was ruined. "This is a residential area." I stared at her, then at the officer, then back at her. "Karen," I said slowly, "you moved next to a farm. That doesn't mean I have to tolerate barbaric animal noises," she snapped. "I have rights. So do my chickens," I shot back, "and they have free speech." Officer Miller let out a long breath and pulled out his notepad. "Ma'am," he said, clearly trying to keep his patience. "Farm animals are permitted in this zone. Mr. Jack is not breaking any laws." Karen's face twisted into an expression that looked like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. "So you're saying I just have to live with it?" "That's what people do when they live next to a farm," Officer Miller replied. Karen was fuming, her face turning red. "Fine, but this isn't over," she hissed before stomping off in the most dramatic fashion possible. I could practically hear the dun-dun-dun music playing in her head. Officer Miller turned back to me. "I'll be honest," he said. "This is the third time she's called in a complaint about your animals. First, it was the rooster, then the cows, now the chickens. What's next? Going to report your pigs for winking. Wouldn't put it past her," I muttered, shaking my head. "I mean, if she's willing to wake up this early just to get me in trouble, she's clearly got nothing better to do." The officer chuckled, tipping his hat. "Good luck, Jack. I have a feeling you'll be seeing me again." He wasn't wrong. Later that afternoon, I was fixing a fence on the east side of my property when I noticed Karen standing at the edge of her yard, holding her phone up like she was filming a documentary. She was muttering into the camera, something about documenting the disturbances and how she was going to expose the farm menace ruining the neighborhood. I sighed. This woman was really dedicating her life to my animals. The next morning, the drama escalated. I was tending to my pigs when I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Karen again. I rushed over, expecting to see her being mauled by a wild animal or something actually serious. Instead, she was standing on her patio, pointing at my fence like it was a crime scene. "What is that?" she shrieked. I followed her gaze and saw absolutely nothing. What exactly am I looking at?" I asked. Karen took a deep, dramatic breath as if preparing for a speech. "That," she said, her voice trembling with rage, "is a goat on your property looking at me." I blinked. "Yeah, that's Gary. He lives here. He's mocking me," she screeched. "Look at his eyes." I turned to Gary. He blinked at me, chewing lazily on a piece of grass. I turned back to Karen. "Karen," I said, dead serious, "he's a goat." "I don't care. I am calling the authorities," she yelled, storming back into her house. And she did. 30 minutes later, Officer Miller was back, this time standing in my driveway with the most tired look I'd ever seen. "All right," he sighed. "What is it this time?" "Jack's goat," Karen snapped. "He's harassing me." The officer looked at me. I looked at him. Then we both looked at Gary, who was still just standing there, chewing grass, looking like the most peaceful creature on earth. "Ma'am," Officer Miller said slowly, "a goat standing on its own property is not harassment." But he was staring at me. Karen insisted. "He's a goat," the officer repeated. "That's literally all they do." Karen's fists clenched. "I demand something be done about this." Officer Miller sighed, turning to me. "Jack, can you do something about your goat?" I shrugged. I could give him sunglasses. Maybe a hat. Karen let out a scream so dramatic that I thought she might pass out. "That's it," she bellowed. "I am going to the city council. I will shut this farm down." With that, she stormed off, slamming her front door so hard that I saw a flock of birds take off from the trees. Officer Miller shook his head, pinching the bridge of his nose. "She's getting worse," he muttered. "You sure you don't have an underground tunnel to escape?" I grinned. "Nope, just a farm and a lot of patience." The officer let out a laugh and got back in his car. "Well, good luck. You're going to need it." As he drove off, I turned back to my animals, who were happily going about their day, completely unaware that they had just become the greatest nemesis of Karen's life. I sighed, glancing at my fence, my house, and then at Karen's window, where I could just barely see the shadow of her spying on me from behind the curtains. Something told me this was only the beginning. The night was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that made living on a farm worth every bit of hard work. The air smelled of fresh hay and damp soil. The stars twinkled overhead, and for once, everything felt normal. I had just finished securing the barn for the night and was about to head inside when I noticed something strange near the fence, a shadow moving low and fast, darting along the property line. At first, I thought it was a stray animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, but then I saw something that made my blood boil, the glint of a phone screen. Someone was sneaking around my farm in the middle of the night. I crept closer, careful not to make a sound, and as I got near enough to see the figure more clearly, I almost laughed out loud. It was Karen, dressed in all black, crouched near my barn holding a can of spray paint. The woman was vandalizing my property. She was shaking the can furiously, aiming it at the wooden boards, ready to unleash whatever ridiculous message she had planned. But before she could start, my watchdog, Buster, decided it was the perfect time to introduce himself. A low, rumbling growl echoed through the night, followed by the sudden explosion of barking. Buster came charging out of nowhere, his powerful frame moving like a missile straight toward Karen. She barely had time to react before she let out the loudest, most dramatic scream I had ever heard, the kind of scream reserved for horror movies. She turned on her heel, dropping the spray can as she bolted for the nearest exit. Unfortunately for her, she had zero sense of direction in the dark. Her foot caught on the uneven dirt path, and before she could catch herself, she tumbled forward, straight into my pigsty. There was a loud splat, a moment of pure silence, then an ear-piercing shriek as she realized where she had landed. I flipped on my flashlight just in time to see her sitting in a glorious mixture of mud and pig manure, her hair caked with filth, her face frozen in horror. The pigs, completely unfazed, snorted and shuffled around her, as if mildly irritated that their new guest was making so much noise. I leaned against the fence, watching the scene unfold. "Karen," I called out, biting back a laugh. "You okay down there?" Her head snapped up, her face contorted with rage. "You did this on purpose," she screeched, flailing to get up, but every attempt only made her sink further into the muck. "Yeah, I totally trained my pigs to set booby traps for trespassers," I said, shaking my head. "What the hell are you even doing out here?" She pointed a shaking, filthy hand at me. I was defending the community by breaking into my farm and committing vandalism, I asked, crossing my arms. She sputtered, struggling to come up with a response. But before she could dig herself deeper, both figuratively and literally, there was another familiar sound in the distance, a siren. Someone had called the cops. Again. By the time Officer Miller arrived, Karen had managed to crawl out of the pigsty, but she was still covered head to toe in sludge. She stood there, arms out, looking like a swamp creature. The second Miller stepped out of his cruiser, his expression was a mix of exhaustion and pure disbelief. "All right," he sighed. "What happened this time?" Before I could even open my mouth, Karen launched into the most ridiculous story I had ever heard. According to her, I had set a trap to humiliate her, trained my dog to chase her down, and possibly even brainwashed my pigs to attack. The level of absurdity was so high that even Miller, who had dealt with every ridiculous call from Karen before, just stood there for a moment, blinking. "Let me get this straight," he finally said. "You, who do not own this farm, were sneaking around in the middle of the night with a can of spray paint, and somehow ended up covered in pig crap, and you're blaming him." Karen threw up her arms, splattering some mud onto herself in the process. "He set me up." Miller turned to me. "Jack, do you have security cameras?" I grinned, pointing to the small, but very noticeable camera mounted on the barn wall. "Sure do." The color drained from Karen's already dirt-smeared face. "You can't. Save it," Miller said, already tired of her antics. "Karen, you were trespassing. You were attempting vandalism." That's two separate offenses right there. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. I could see the wheels turning in her head, desperately trying to find a way to spin this in her favor. Finally, she took a deep breath and went for the last desperate Karen move she had left. I'm calling animal control. That got a reaction out of both me and Miller. For what? I asked, genuinely curious what kind of complaint she could pull out this time. She crossed her arms, her nose wrinkled in disgust as she pointed at my pigs. These animals are living in filth. It's a health hazard. Miller looked at the pigs, then back at her. Karen, it's a farm. It's a pigsty. They are pigs. This is literally normal. But she wasn't listening. She had already whipped out her phone and was dialing. Sure enough, the next morning, an animal control inspector showed up, a professional-looking man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression who clearly took his job seriously. He introduced himself and asked to inspect the animals. I happily let him. I knew there was nothing wrong with my farm. In fact, I took damn good care of my animals. Karen, however, was standing off to the side, looking smug as if she had already won. I watched with amusement as the inspector thoroughly checked everything. The cows, the chickens, the goats, even the pigsty where Karen had taken her unfortunate dive. After nearly 30 minutes, he finally turned back to her. Ma'am, he said, his tone polite but firm. These animals are in perfect health. The farm is well maintained and meets all legal requirements. Karen's smug smile froze. What? In fact, the inspector continued, it seems like a false complaint was made, which is actually a finable offense. Karen's face went from red to purple. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, he said, jotting something down on his clipboard. And since this isn't the first time you've wasted official resources, you'll be receiving a notice in the mail. I could practically see the steam coming out of Karen's ears. She opened her mouth, then shut it, then opened it again. Then, without another word, she stomped away, her entire plan backfiring spectacularly. As soon as she was gone, Officer Miller shook his head. Jack, he said, rubbing his temples, I don't know what you did to deserve this woman as a neighbor, but I think you might be cursed. I laughed, shaking my head. Oh, trust me, this is just the beginning. The morning started like any other. The sun was rising over my farm. The cows were lazily chewing their morning hay, and my chickens were strutting around like they owned the place. I had just poured myself a fresh cup of coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen screeching from her yard. At this point, my body had a Pavlovian response to her voice. Instant exhaustion. I sighed, setting down my mug, and walked outside, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense she had cooked up this time. Karen stood on her porch, waving her phone around like she had just captured the Loch Ness Monster on video. The second she saw me, she stormed toward the property line, her expression set somewhere between triumph and fury. I didn't say anything, just crossed my arms and waited for the show to begin. I have evidence, she screeched, jabbing at her phone screen. I recorded your cows moo at 2 in the morning. Do you know what sleep deprivation does to a person? I raised an eyebrow. I run a farm, Karen. I'm very familiar with not getting enough sleep. She completely ignored my response and shoved the phone in my face. Sure enough, the video showed my cows in the middle of the night, standing by the fence and letting out a few moos. Nothing dramatic, just normal cow noises, the kind of thing you'd expect when you live next to a farm. But to Karen, this was apparently a federal offense. Karen, I said, rubbing my temples, what exactly do you want me to do? Teach them sign language. I want you to control them, she snapped. Train them to be quiet. I stared at her, wondering if she actually believed what she was saying. You want me to train cows to stop mowing? Yes, she huffed, as if that was a completely reasonable request. I took a slow, deep breath. Karen, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Her jaw dropped in outrage. How dare you? I have rights. So do my cows, I replied. And their right is to moo whenever the hell they want. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. I am going to the city council. Again, I asked. What's the complaint this time? That my cows are expressing themselves too freely? She turned on her heel, marching back to her house with the dramatic flair of a soap opera villain. I figured that was the end of it for the day, but of course, I had underestimated Karen's ability to escalate things to ridiculous levels. Later that evening, I saw her in her yard, talking animatedly to a man in a suit. He was nodding, holding a clipboard, and taking notes. Curious, I walked over to the fence. Hey, what's going on? Karen turned to me with a smug grin. I've reported your farm as a public nuisance. This is an official inspection. The man, clearly a local official, cleared his throat. Yes, sir. We've received a formal complaint about excessive noise, unsanitary conditions, and general disruption to the neighborhood. I sighed. Let me guess. Karen here is your one and only complainant. The man hesitated, then glanced at his clipboard. Well, yes, but we are obligated to investigate. I nodded, stepping back. Go ahead, then. Inspect all you want. Karen's smug expression faltered. She clearly hadn't expected me to be so cooperative. I watched as the inspector walked through my property, checking the barns, the animal enclosures, and even testing the sound levels. It took nearly an hour, but when he finally came back, he looked more amused than concerned. Well, he said, flipping his clipboard shut, everything here is perfectly up to code. The animals are healthy, the enclosures are clean, and as for the noise, he glanced at Karen. This is a farm. The sounds are well within the legal limit. Karen looked like she was going to explode. But no violations, the inspector said, giving me a small nod before turning to leave. Karen stood there, fists clenched, absolutely seething. I could almost hear the gears in her head turning, trying to come up with some new way to make my life miserable. Then, like clockwork, she gasped dramatically and pointed at my fence. That's trespassing, she shrieked. I followed her gaze, confused, until I saw what she was talking about. One of my goats, Gary, had stuck his head through the fence and was happily chewing on some grass on her side of the property line. His hooves were still firmly planted on my side, but his head was technically over the boundary. I turned back to Karen, deadpan. You're trying to report my goat for trespassing? He is on my property, she shouted. His head is on your property, I corrected. His body is still on mine. I don't care. He needs to be fined. I let out a long, slow sigh, then turned to Gary. Gary, you're under arrest. Karen's nostrils flared. Stop mocking me. Sorry. I waved my hands. Let's take this seriously. Officer Miller is going to love this one. And so, for the third time that week, Officer Miller arrived. He got out of his car, looking more tired than ever, and immediately asked, what did she do this time? Karen stomped her foot. His goat is trespassing. Miller looked at Gary, who was still chewing lazily, then back at Karen, then at me, then at Karen again. You call me for a goat sticking his head through a fence? Yes, she shouted. It's illegal. Miller sighed so hard I thought he might pass out. That is not trespassing. Karen let out a frustrated scream. So nothing is going to be done about this? Miller pinched the bridge of his nose. If you make one more ridiculous complaint, I will start fining you for wasting police resources. That shut her up. She opened and closed her mouth a few times, looking absolutely livid but unwilling to push her luck any further. Without another word, she stormed back inside and slammed her door. Miller turned to me. You need hazard pay for living next to this woman. I laughed. I'd take it if you're offering. He chuckled, shaking his head as he walked back to his cruiser. Good luck, Jack. You're going to need it. As he drove off, I turned back to Gary, who was still blissfully unaware of the chaos he had just caused. Well, buddy, I said, scratching his head. I think you just made an enemy for life. Karen's blind snapped shut in the window behind him. Something told me she was far from done. Karen had been humiliated more times than I could count, but if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she never knew when to quit. Every time she failed, she came back even angrier, even pettier, and even more determined to make my life miserable. I knew she was planning something. I could feel it in the way she stared at my farm from her window, the way she gritted her teeth every time she saw me feeding my animals. She wasn't just annoyed anymore. She wanted revenge. I didn't have to wait long to find out what she was up to. One morning, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found a man in a suit standing there, holding a clipboard and looking far too serious for my liking. Behind him, standing a few feet back with her arms crossed and an arrogant smirk on her face, was Karen. Good morning, sir, the man said, adjusting his glasses. I'm here from the city council. We received a formal petition regarding your property. I blinked, glancing at Karen, who was practically vibrating with excitement. A petition? Yes, the man continued. A number of residents have raised concerns about your farm, citing excessive noise, unsanitary conditions, and general disruption to the community. I stared at him, then at Karen, then back at him. You're telling me multiple residents signed a petition against me? That is correct, he said, flipping through his papers. I have it right here. Karen snickered. It's over, Jack. The community has spoken. I reached for the clipboard, and the inspector handed it over. I skimmed the list of signatures, expecting to see some of my neighbors' names, maybe a few people I had never met. But as I read down the list, my confusion turned to amusement. Then, as I reached the bottom, amusement turned to outright laughter. Sir, I said, trying to keep a straight face. Do you mind reading some of these names out loud? The inspector frowned, taking the clipboard back and glancing down. Let's see. John Doe, Mickey Mouse, Elvis Presley. Oh, Karen's face went pale. Are these fake signatures? The inspector asked, flipping through the pages with growing suspicion. Looks like it, I said, grinning. Unless you really think Elvis came back from the dead just to complain about my cows. Karen grabbed the clipboard from his hands. This is ridiculous. It's not fake. The inspector looked at her. Ma'am, we take fraudulent petitions very seriously. If you forged signatures to push a false complaint, you could be facing legal consequences. Karen opened her mouth, then shut it. Her eyes darted between us as if searching for a way out, but she had backed herself into a corner. The inspector gave me an apologetic nod, took the clipboard, and left, shaking his head. As soon as he was gone, Karen whirled on me, her face twisted with rage. You think this is funny? I shrugged. A little bit. She clenched her fists. You haven't won. I have one last move. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, can't wait to see this one. She stormed off, and for a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. That was never a good sign. I kept an eye on my property, made sure my animals were safe, and even checked my security cameras more than usual. But nothing happened. No cops, no complaints, no midnight invasions. I started to think maybe, just maybe, she had finally given up. I was wrong. It happened on a Saturday morning. I had just finished breakfast when I heard an unusual noise, one I had never heard before, a stampede. My heart dropped as I rushed outside and saw chaos unfolding before my eyes. My cows were out, my goats were out, my chickens were running wild. Every single animal had somehow gotten loose. I sprinted to my pasture and found the source of the disaster. My fence had been cut. Panic turned to fury as I realized exactly who was behind this. Karen had finally snapped. She had intentionally released my animals. But as much as I wanted to storm over to her house and confront her, I had bigger problems. My animals were confused, scared, and heading straight for the road. If I didn't get them under control, someone could get hurt. I grabbed a bucket of feed and started calling my cows, hoping to lure them back. It worked, kind of. A few turned around, but the rest were too spooked. My goats were bouncing everywhere, and my chickens, well, they were living their best lives, completely uninterested in my emergency. Then, as if the situation wasn't ridiculous enough, I heard something that almost made me drop the bucket. Karen was screaming. I turned and saw her on her front porch, flailing her arms like a mad woman. Why? Because my animals had invaded her yard. My cows were trampling her precious flower beds. My chickens were pecking at her expensive outdoor furniture, and one of my goats, good old Gary, was casually chewing on her designer handbag. Get them off my property, she screeched, running around in absolute panic. I watched, arms crossed, as she tried to shoo away a group of chickens, only to slip and faceplant into a pile of manure. Karma had never been so immediate. Jack, do something, she wailed. I took my time walking over, pretending to think. I don't know, Karen. I'd hate to trespass on your property without permission. She sat up, her entire body shaking with rage. I'm calling the police. And for once, I agreed. Good idea, I said, pulling out my phone. Let's get them involved. By the time Officer Miller arrived, Karen was a complete mess. Her hair was tangled with dirt, her clothes were stained beyond repair, and she looked like she had been through a war. I, on the other hand, stood there calmly, waiting for justice. All right, Miller said, stepping out of his cruiser. What happened this time? I pointed to the broken fence. Someone cut my fence and let my animals loose. That's property damage and endangerment. Miller's eyes darkened as he turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you know anything about this? Karen's lips pressed together. She looked everywhere except at him. Ma'am, he repeated, you're looking at a serious fine and potential charges if you were involved. Her mouth opened, then closed. Then, with the absolute worst acting I had ever seen, she gasped. Oh my gosh. I just remembered. I saw some kids running around last night. Yes, they must have done it. Miller stared at her. I stared at her. Even Gary, still chewing on her handbag, seemed unimpressed. Ma'am, Miller said flatly, You don't have any kids in this neighborhood. It was teenagers, she stammered. Ma'am, that's enough. You're being fined for property damage and reckless endangerment. Karen let out a guttural screech that could probably shatter glass, but it didn't matter. She had finally done herself in. As Miller wrote her a citation, I turned back to my animals. Come on, guys. Let's go home. Karen sat in the middle of her ruined yard, too stunned to speak. I had won, and I wasn't even done yet. Karen was finished, and she knew it. The moment Officer Miller handed her that fine, the reality of her situation finally started to sink in. She sat there in her destroyed yard, covered in dirt, manure, and regret, looking like she had just survived a natural disaster. Meanwhile, my animals were safely back in their pens, and my fence was already being repaired. The chaos she had unleashed had completely backfired, and for the first time, she had nothing to say. No threats, no screaming, no dramatic speeches about how she was going to shut down my farm. Just silence. I had expected her to come back swinging, to plot some ridiculous scheme that would somehow top everything she had done before. But over the next few days, Karen stayed inside. Her blinds remained shut, her front door unopened. It was almost eerie. The woman who had made it her personal mission to destroy my life had suddenly gone quiet. Part of me wanted to believe she had finally given up, but I wasn't that naive. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to regroup, to scheme, to come back with something even more ridiculous. And sure enough, she did. It started with a letter. A formal-looking document slipped under my door while I was out in the fields. At first, I thought it was another complaint, maybe some last-ditch attempt to get me fined or shut down. But when I opened it, I nearly dropped the paper from laughing so hard. It was a legal notice from Karen demanding a public apology. According to her, I had intentionally humiliated and harassed her, and unless I issued a formal, recorded apology, she would sue me for emotional distress. I read the letter 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Karen, the woman who had trespassed on my property, vandalized my barn, faked complaints to the city, and literally cut my fence, was demanding I apologize to her? It was so absurd, so mind-blowingly stupid, that I had to sit down for a moment just to process it. I did the only logical thing. I took the letter straight to Officer Miller. He read it once, then again, then let out the longest sigh I had ever heard. Jack, he said, rubbing his temples. This woman is going to give me an ulcer. I grinned. So, should I send her a bouquet of flowers with my apology? Miller groaned. No, just ignore it. There's no legal standing here. If anything, she's the one who should be apologizing to you. But Karen wasn't done. When the letter didn't work, she took things online. The next morning, I woke up to an explosion of notifications on my phone. My farm's Facebook page, normally a quiet little space where I posted about fresh eggs and homemade honey, was flooded with angry comments. Strangers were calling me a bully, an animal abuser, a menace to the neighborhood. Confused, I scrolled through the chaos, trying to figure out what the hell had happened. And then I saw it. Karen had made a video. A full, dramatic, tear-filled video posted on every social media platform she could find, in which she painted herself as the tragic victim of the evil farmer next door. She claimed my animals had tormented her, that I had personally harassed her, that she had been forced to live in fear because of my constant bullying. She even faked crying on camera, holding up her destroyed yard like it was the aftermath of a natural disaster. I couldn't believe what I was watching. It was so over the top, so ridiculous, that I thought no one would take her seriously. But the internet loves drama, and Karen knew exactly how to manipulate people. Within hours, the video had gone viral. People were sharing it, commenting, demanding justice for Karen. Some even started a fundraiser for her, convinced she was a poor, helpless victim who had been wronged. I should have been furious, but honestly, I was impressed. It took a special kind of person to fail so spectacularly and still find a way to flip the narrative in their favor. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. She had lied too much. See, it's one thing to twist the truth. It's another thing to fabricate a sob story so exaggerated that it starts to collapse under its own weight. And that's exactly what happened. First, people started asking for evidence. They wanted proof that my farm was actually a menace, that I had done the things she claimed. When she couldn't provide any, people got suspicious. Then, locals from our town, people who actually knew me, who had been to my farm, who had witnessed Karen's insanity, firsthand started commenting. They told the real story about how Karen had spent months trying to shut me down, about the fake complaints, the trespassing, the fence-cutting incident. And just like that, the internet turned on her. The very same people who had rallied behind her started calling her out. People dug up the fine she had received, the reports from Officer Miller, even footage from my security cameras showing her sneaking onto my property. The Karen is a victim story collapsed in real time. And then the worst thing imaginable happened to her. She became a meme. Screenshots of her video, her ridiculous expressions, her fake crying, all turned into jokes. People remixed her voice, made parody videos, even edited clips of her dramatic scream over footage of my totally normal, innocent animals. Her meltdown became internet gold. Karen had spent months trying to destroy my life. Instead, she destroyed her own reputation in a matter of days. The last time I saw her, she was outside, loading boxes into a moving truck. She wasn't wearing her usual smug expression. No, this time she looked defeated. She knew she couldn't live here anymore, not after all of this. She had become a joke, and Karen couldn't stand being laughed at. I leaned on the fence, sipping my coffee as I watched her struggle with a particularly heavy box. I could have helped, but I didn't. Before she got in her car, she turned to me one last time. I expected her to say something, some last parting insult, some final attempt to regain control of the situation. But she didn't. She just scowled, muttered something under her breath, and slammed the door. As she drove away, I took a deep breath, enjoying the peace and quiet. It was over. Later that day, I got a call from Officer Miller. "She's gone," he said, sounding relieved. "Finally," I replied. "You know what's funny?" he added. "I checked the records. The people who bought her house, they're huge animal lovers. They're actually excited about living next to your farm." I nearly dropped my phone laughing. Karen had spent all that time, all that energy, trying to shut my farm down, only to move away and be replaced by people who actually liked me. It was perfect. It was karma. And it was the most satisfying ending possible.